Okay. Where do you want to start? You want to start with Krakow or you want to start with Bazan? How do you want to work through this stuff? In Krakauer? All right. So I've got my notepad here. My desk is kind of awkwardly set up for it. Um, First off, I want to ask you how you navigated reading this chunk of a book. Because it was quite a bit of material, but how was it for you? This is probably the largest amount of reading that I've assigned from a single author this semester.
The
I was
amount, oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah, go
but
ahead.
the length of it was long, but I feel like his vocabulary and how he wrote um, everything, it was a little bit easier to digest because the vocabulary it wasn't hard this time. So I pretty much understood all of his concepts and everything that he was saying.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. What did y'all make of his structure of his argument, or at least the portion of it that we read? Any thoughts on how he structured it? Because it's very methodical, right? He starts out talking about photography, which he actually dives into in the chapter before that we didn't even actually read, kind of extremely in depth, and then works through the kind of the elements that make cinema cinema, like how does film actually work and what distinguishes it as a medium. That's really what he's trying to drive at here. um, and for Krakauer, who's coming out of the Frankfurt School, so we've already talked about some of that stuff. For him, what he's really interested in is, how does cinema privilege or create a sense of realism? And he wants us to work through that. And that's really like his big thing, is that realism is the most important function of cinema for him. And he wants to understand how it does that. Okay. So each chapter, at least as we read it, is setting up different parts of this argument. So he starts out with basic concepts, he moves to establishing physical existence, and then moves on from there, right? So let's talk a little bit about the basic concepts here. So he gives us two key properties. Film is uniquely equipped to record and reveal physical reality, and hence it gravitates toward it, right? It wants to perform that function. It also, unlike other arts, especially photography, which is its closest relative, uses editing to establish a meaningful continuity of shots. Okay. So, unlike what he's getting at here, is unlike Eisenstein, who's thinking about the compositional elements of the shot as creating some of that uh, connection between images. Krakauer is thinking about that purely in compositional terms, not in relationship shot to shot. That's his pushback on Eisenstein. So when he's talking about Eisenstein does this or Eisenstein did that in these chapters, he's pushing back against the idea that the shot itself is going to have this compositional tension that is doing something. Okay. He's saying that editing and the shot composition itself are separate functions, and that's what cinema is. Okay, so he is differentiating a little bit here. Okay, he also in this section points out two main tendencies, and he uses Lumiere and the Lumiere brothers and Méliès as his primary examples. What are those two main tendencies he points to? One is formative and the other is realist, right? Realist and formative. What is the difference between a realist tendency and a formative tendency for Krakauer? Any wild guesses?
A realist would be more like unedited and would kind of show life as it is, sort of more placing a camera in front of um, an environment where he's not really, whoever is directing is not really changing anything.
Okay. So that's a realist tendency. What's a formative one then? What differentiates what Méliès does with the camera or how he creates his films from the Lumieres?
Well, Méliès uses like mise en scène, and he's very much like about the art itself and more about making stories instead of like making reality into a story. He makes stories into reality.
Right. He's forming the reality in front of the screen, right? So this is what he's talking about. One's a realist one, you capture reality. One is you create reality. And he's not necessarily privileging one or the other. He's just saying these are the two main tendencies in cinema, and we need to understand what it is they're doing, how they're doing it, in order to create what he calls realism. Okay? Now, what's weird about Krakauer is that he does not actually mean a simple indexical relationship. Okay, so I'm going to read this part from the introduction to the book real quick. Should have had it here. Okay, so Krakauer's investment in the photographic basis of film does not rest on the iconicity of the photographic sign, at least not in the narrow sense of a literal resemblance or analogy with a self-identical object. Now, this stuff we'll get into when we deal with semiotics in depth, but this is kind of what we're talking about, is like, how do we interpret and read images, right? Okay, so continuing. Nor, for that matter, does he conceive of the indexical, the photochemical bond that links image and referent in any positivist way as merely anchoring the analogical truth of the representation. Rather, the same indexicality that allows photographic film to record and figure the world also inscribes the image with moments of temporality and contingency that disfigure the representation. If Krakauer seeks to ground his film aesthetics in the medium of photography, it is because photographic representation has the perplexing ability not only to resemble the world it depicts, but also to render it strange, to destroy habitual fictions of self-identity and familiarity. Okay, so what does that mean? If it's destroying these things and it has that ability, it's not necessarily just referencing the real world. That's not what he means by realism. But cinema has a certain power to it to disfigure and defamiliarize those things. And how does that create realism? Any guesses? Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
I,
It's a whole lot. But
I thought I thought when I read that he basically was saying when you have realism and you have the ability to photograph it, you only get what the photograph shows. And it can be horrible, it can be strange, it can be terrible. But with cinema, you are recording something. So it might be terrible for that 1 second, like a baby might be crying for a second, but
right.
in the cinema can capture the second. The pictures can only capture what's actually happening right there. And
okay.
It's hard to make sure if you're going to do realist cinema that you capture it as real as possible, because you don't want to lose the authenticity of a photograph trying to like cover up what's actually going on in the real world.
For sure, that is a huge component of it, right? But he does step beyond that just a little bit, because remember, he's not just privileging that, like you know, what you're seeing behind me is the actual room I'm in, right? For him, he's not just talking about that. He's talking about how it constructs the reality as well, right? So how we understand and read that reality and interpret that reality. And so by him saying that, like, it's not just about the indexical iconic relationship between the image and what we're interpreting and what actually physically exists that it is a photograph of. He also says that film has an ability to show us things which are otherwise unshowable, and that is also realistic. Not necessarily just in a physical sense, but right, like if we in the next section where he starts talking about the different properties that cinema has. And he talks about the close-up and how you can reveal things big and small, right? That's not a pure perceptual indexicality, right? But cinema can reveal things, and that the Méliès films reveal elements that might be inherent in psychological makeup, right? Expressionism, in German, expressionism is an example of this, right? It's not realistic, yet it creates reality by envisioning a world that we actually cannot see or represent indexicality because the shadows are literally painted on the walls, that sort of thing. Okay, so he is saying that, but it's not a not but, it's a and or kind of an additional thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes more sense.
Okay, good. Kayla, do you have your hand up? Kayla Cohen.
Yeah, but I was just gonna say, to show like the camera kind of acts as a third party to kind of show humanity, and I feel like it really like it makes the viewer like aware of like life experiences and realities, especially like with a realism like lens. It's kind of like when you're looking for something in your room and you can't find it, but like you ask someone to look for it and they find it instantly. It's kind of like that effect in a way I view it.
Okay, yeah, I think that plays a little bit of a part into it. Yeah, for sure. Kind of the ability of cinema to reveal, right? So let's keep working through just a little bit here. So in chapter 3, he's talking about the establishment of physical existence, right? So literally what he's talking about in this chapter is how the medium of film is distinct from photography. Okay, he wants to understand how film establishes physical existence. And he works through kind of the two main functions. The first one is the recording function, and the second one is the revealing function. The biggest two parts of the recording function for him, and this, the second one, we'll get to what I was talking to Jessica about here in a minute, with kind of like stepping beyond purely indexical and like being able to reveal different things that aren't just this is the object kind of thing. But the first one, movement. Okay, why is movement important to cinema for Krakauer? Relative to photography or other arts even, plastic arts, not necessarily like dance or theater or anything like that. Can photography show motion necessarily? No, it can imply motion, right? It can convey a sense of motion, but it can't actually show us the motion, right? The moving part of the moving image for him is extremely important. And within that, there are several different types of movement that he calls inherently cinematic. Okay, one is chase, right? He talks about chase scenes. The other is dancing, right? Why is dancing, just to kind of drive his point home about the recording function a little bit here, why is dancing a cinematic type of movement for Krakauer if he's making a difference between how it would be presented on stage versus on film? What are things that film can do that you can't do in a theater? We saw some of them last week in 42nd Street.
You can make like cuts, if that's what you meant. Like you can change where you are. You could do a close-up of whoever's dancing to really emphasize like the emotion and art of the dance.
Right. You can also completely remove the camera, like in that sequence from the Busby Berkeley shots at the end of the film, completely remove the camera from audience perspective, right? And create movements that are inherently not stage worthy, right? Like if you saw them on the stage, you would just be bored for 10 minutes. But because you have this ability with the cinema to create a different sense of what that realistic movement looks like, right? And to record it in different ways, you can present a new reality, a different reality based on the perspective of the camera to the audience. Okay. He also mentions, in addition to movement, inanimate objects, which I always find really interesting and also confusing. And this is the part where I will also say that for me, Krakauer in this book specifically is like the most hard to grasp person in the world for me. Okay, so if y'all feel like y'all are struggling from week to week, know that I have been reading this same book for like 16 years and I still maybe get like 45 to 50% of what he's actually saying. Okay, part of it's that he's coming out of philosophy, right? He's like a high-minded philosophical writer and thinker. So that's part of it. I'm not a philosopher. I don't have a huge philosophy background. But this section kind of drives home a little bit about like what it is that I can't always quite grasp. Okay, so let's work through it just a second here. Now, why are inanimate objects like important to cinema for him? Why does he say they're important? What can cinema do to inanimate objects? This ties a little bit into the last part. You don't have to refer to the book. Just think about it for a second. Listen. Okay. I have a book. Okay. I am going to move the book towards the camera. Okay. If I just cut to the close-up of the book, right, and we study it for a second, what does that do to us as viewers? It does a couple of different things, but what are they? Just describe them.
Doesn't it add like meaning to the object when you're focusing on it like that?
Right. Yeah, and especially if it's important to the story that's being told, right? Or the narrative function, right? But beyond that, unlike a photograph or a stage production, right? The cinema allows us to consider objects in motion, relative distance, all sorts of different things that you don't normally get from either a single photograph or stage, right? So we might spend 5 minutes in a film considering tailoring on a dress, right? So if you've seen the film Phantom Thread, there are all these great sequences in there where it's just people sewing dresses and you're kind of watching that happen, okay? But you can do that all the time. Objects take on increasingly significant meaning in cinema in ways that they don't necessarily in the other arts because of how they're tied into the first part of this, the movement and screen composition. Okay. So he actually says, right, that film is free to dwell on parts of the appearance, right? So even though we might, this is also him talking about the camera, right? Even though we might, while watching a play or might while looking at a photograph, spend our own cognitive function and our time thinking about certain minute details and objects, that film can focus on it kind of inherently, absent our own processes of it, right? So even though I might watch, you know, a movie with Ethan Hawke in it or something and go like, Ethan Hawke is an incredibly handsome person, right? Even though that might be my thought process, the camera can actually just sit there on his face and drive that point home. And it might have nothing to do with my thought process at all. Okay. Do you see how I'm talking about? Like this gets a little nebulous and weird to wrap your head around, right? So I find it makes a little more sense once we move into the next part, which is where he talks about the revealing functions of cinema. Okay. So he breaks this down into 3 different parts, the small and the big, close-up and long shot. What does he say close-ups and long shots do to us as viewers and do for the images we're looking at? Anybody want to take a crack at that
Long
one?
shots. Oh,
Yeah,
you
go ahead,
it.
Jessica. Go ahead.
Long shots are kind of there to draw you in more in a way, and then close-ups are there to make you focus.
Yeah, so we are directing focus in different ways, right? So that's an essential function he's talking about. Yes, indeed. What do they reveal though? So if these are revealing functions, what do close-ups reveal? What do long shots reveal? And this can be literal or metaphorical. Like you can talk about this in literal terms because in some way Krakauer also is. What do long shots, or what we might even call wide shots in more common parlance, what do those reveal more often than not?
The whole,
Yeah, the big
scene,
picture,
like
right?
the
So it
whole
might be
picture.
scale, crowd size, right? All
Scope,
kinds of stuff.
setting.
Well, I'm sorry, what was that, Jonathan?
They reveal like scope and setting.
Yeah, scope and setting, exactly. Now, conversely, what does the close-up reveal? And it can be a number of different things, of course.
Close-ups can draw our attention to like more intimate ideas, like close-ups of faces and objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more intimate detail. Sarah down here in the chat says close-ups reveal meaning or emotion. Long shots give special attention to masses. And I think that's correct. Okay. Okay. Now he says that the transient is an essential revealing function. First off, what does he mean with what does transient mean even? The word.
Doesn't it mean temporary
Mm-hmm.
in a way, like passing through?
Yeah. Right. So it's all about, again, tying back into the recording function, because recording and revealing functions work together, right? It's revealing that kind of passing of time, of objects through space, things in motion, basically, is what he's getting at here. And it can be time, space, whatever, okay? The third part of this is it reveals blind spots of the mind. What in the hell does that mean? Blind spots of the mind.
So basically, it just shows what you wouldn't perceive or what you wouldn't see just from looking. And because like I can't tell what you're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
can't tell what I'm thinking. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, it allows us to see those things that we can't, naturally see with our eyes.
Okay, yes, that's part of that. There's a second part of it too that's important, which is that in addition to those types of blind spots, it also reveals potential blind spots of the mind from the person in charge of making it, right? So that it can, this gets a little into the psychoanalysis and stuff like that we'll learn about later in the semester. But when he's formulating all of these thoughts, primarily in the 1950s, and this book is published in 1960, like psychoanalysis on the whole is kind of in an uptick. And so part of what he's wrestling with is that he does not yet, because psychoanalysis is not a supremely popular form of theory yet, he's wrestling with the idea of how do you conceptualize kind of the psychological aspects of what you see on screen, right? And what he's saying is that the camera removes those blind spots and then reveals them to whoever, right? So that you can read the image as also having a meaning that was input into it, but he's not thinking about it in those terms yet. Okay, so for him, it's still an issue, a problem that he can't quite work around. So it gets hung up on what you were saying, Amisha, which is that like it reveals certain things that are unknowable to us about other people. Okay, and then to tie that back into what that big quote that I read earlier, right? Once again, realism is not just the indexical relationship, okay? It is also about those distortions, and it's through the distortions that we can reveal reality. So in an earlier book, From Caligari to Hitler, Krakauer has this whole theory laid out of how he can read the rise of fascism in Germany through German Expressionism and the other artistic movements of the Weimar era, okay? Now, none of those films are inherently fascist. The filmmakers themselves, by and large, all except for one of them, fled Germany and were not Nazis. They were all communists. But because of the obsessions, he's saying, that you can see in those films with German society, right? Because of the way that the Heimat film develops in Germany, separate from Expressionism, that you can see the rise of all that fascism coming in popular culture. It's not a perfect theory, but that's also what he's getting at here with kind of trying to understand how these distortions can reveal, okay? So that, again, because he's tied to the Frankfurt School, it's all about kind of uncovering ideology and ideological constructs in some way as well. All right. So being able to read the film as real, whether it's just indexical or not. Okay. All right. How do y'all feel about Krakauer's theory as he lays it out here?
I'm gonna have to reread it.
Yeah, a lot in my experience.
I'm gonna definitely reread it. He does organize well, but the philosophical side, that's gonna take me a minute to understand.
It'll take you years.
It doesn't matter how well
that's not a slight. It's just how it is. Yeah, I find that Krakauer is very interesting to think about in relation to where these considerations go. So when we get to the Stephen Prince piece in a little bit, you'll be able to like pick up strands of that and understand a little bit about how it's shifted over time, and where what usually happens in film theory is that your film studies scholars, your professors, pick up the elements that they think are important to carry forward, and the other stuff kind of gets left behind. And then, of course, there are always people that go back and like, oh, we've considered this thing and talked about this thing to death, but, you know, there's this one sentence in Siegfried Krakauer where he says this, and I really want to pick that apart, right? So championing different aspects of it. So you'll see that happen in the Stephen Prince piece. Hopefully y'all did like pick up some of that as you were reading that piece about digital effects. Let's shift gears really quickly, just because we've already spent a lot of time on Krakauer, and talk about Bazin. Bazin has kind of the inverse problem as a reader that Krakauer does, where Krakauer writes a whole lot to kind of boil down a single concept. Bazin has basically given us about 8 pages, and it is just jam-packed full of claims about photography and its meaning and its relationship to reality that he doesn't even try to fully back up all the time, okay? So it's a very dense piece, even though it's a quick read. And it's easy to get the parts you need out of it, but like if you really think through it a whole lot, it's really complicated what he's saying. And I'm not sure that I buy all of it. We'll talk about that. I've got some things to ask y'all about as we work through it. But yeah, what was your experience reading through Bazin? And the reason I keep asking y'all about your experience is because I do want y'all to just think about how it is you're working through essays as you read them, and kind of your own processes of going through it, because that will inform, you know, how you end up writing about this stuff later. So what are your thoughts here about this Bazin essay before we dive into the theory part of it?
I found it interesting that he compared the way we use photography to how they mummified people, and it was used as like preserving a life. So when I thought about it, I was like, that's interesting, because that's kind of what we do with pictures and with videos. We capture our moments so that later on we can look back and we can see ourselves at different stages of life. Because without them, I mean, we pretty much only have our memories at that point. So
Yeah, and then what happens beyond, 3 or 4 generations when nobody remembers you anymore,
right.
right? Like nobody alive remembers you, so they only have the record of you. Okay, so that's a very famous portion of this essay. He has a turn of phrase that he uses in other writing, where he talks about film as change mummified, right? Which it's thinking through the process of film itself as something that's constantly moving forward, right? When you watch a movie, you're watching objects in motion, but the vast majority of films that you would ever watch or could ever watch are films of dead people, right? So change mummified is what he's talking about here. And previous era, it's not just the people here, it's like everything that is in the past is present here. Okay, so very quickly, just want to break down kind of what he does at the beginning so that we can get to the more outrageous portions of his claims. The first part here is basically spent breaking down the relationships with indexicality and photography, and working through them in kind of a way that's directly related to art history. Okay, so these are very ambitious claims, but they're still at least grounded in a historical understanding of what is going on in art. Okay, and he uses this term plastic arts, but what he's talking about is physical arts. Okay, visual arts, so photography, painting, that sort of thing. So the first one we've already covered. The first big claim is that the visual arts share a psychological motivation with embalming. They preserve bodies from the ravages of time. The second one is that before photography, all visual arts followed this motivation. Okay, so he's thinking about painting, clay molds, statuary, that sort of thing. He's saying before photographs, all of the visual arts followed this motivation. But this created an uneasy split between, on the one hand, the psychological desire for presentation, okay, so how we're presenting that, and on the other, aesthetic aims, okay, so we want to present something as real, but we also want to make it pleasing or to have meaning in an aesthetic manner, okay. The third part is that the arrival of photography freed painting from this predicament, so that abstract art was able to arrive because photography had taken over the function of realism, of resemblance. Okay. Well, let's step back from that one just a second. Do you buy that argument? I mean, it's a little whatever, but he's basically saying that before photography, right, the main purpose of art was seen as kind of this preservationist mode, right? So whether it was all of these major art movements, including French Impressionism, right, and Romantic art, and all of the Renaissance paintings, was all about presenting as close as possible an indexical realism. Okay, something that was going to preserve something in time. Go ahead, Jessica.
I would disagree and agree. Because a lot of the art back then was you could only commission somebody to do a picture of you if you had money. And like a lot of money, like royalty or like a member of the royal family, or you were a great businessman, or et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So they got pictures, and even their pictures, people say to this day, like, that's not what Mona Lisa really looked like. That's not what the Queen really looked like. So I get where he's going with it in a way. Like, it did preserve, like, okay, we do have an idea of what King Henry or, you know, they look like. We have an idea, but we don't really know.
Right.
So for him to say like that's the best or only way of preserving, I would disagree.
Well, I think he's more arguing. I mean, I think you're right, but I also think he has a little more nuance there, in that what he's getting at is that the impulse of the creation of the artist, no matter what the subject was to create a realistic portrayal of whatever it was. So whether it's a still life, so like a painting of fruit, or a pastoral scene where you're getting a landscape, maybe some village, whatever, that it's all about preservation in some way of realism. And he's saying what photography did was it took over that function and allowed painting to become something beyond that representational relationship with the real world. Okay.
I guess I would correct my statement then and say, like, depending on what was being painted at that time.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm saying like this is a complicated thing that I also would provide pushback on.
Yeah.
You're coming at it from a position of, you know, whether or not the indexical was ever like that, which is part of a pushback, right? But also, how does anybody study art history or anything yet in this class? So a little bit. And y'all don't have to know this, but if you were studying art or you were an artist and you were thinking about abstract painting, right? So even stuff like Jackson Pollock, right? The paint splatter stuff, right? How does that form an indexical relationship? Right? So we'll learn all of this next week. We'll walk through it. But indexical is like, it is a representation of the actual object. Okay. So how does something like a Jackson Pollock painting represent something that was real and physically present at the moment of its creation? Any guesses?
I'll try my best here because I kind of see what you're saying. Would it be like he's trying to make you self-aware of like the paint itself?
Yeah, so the paint itself is a representation, but how is it an indexical representation? How does it refer to the actual physical reality? Well, it's fine. I'll walk you through it, right? So how does someone create an abstract painting? The same way they do any painting, right? Okay. So let's move away even from the splatter. Let's just say it's like the brush strokes, right? Like just big, bold color brush strokes. What does that brush stroke have an indexical or iconic relationship to? How does it get created? There's brush on canvas going up, right? So it's representative of the physical motion that was used to create it, right? Another way to think about this might be, okay, fingerprints, right? Your fingerprint is not a physical representation of anything other than a fingerprint, right? And if you just look at one, it's not unlike an abstract painting, okay? It's in fact completely abstracted from who you are, your personality, everything, right? And yet, it is a perfect record of your physical existence, represented through the act of making that fingerprint on a paper. Okay? So it's not necessarily true, right, what he's saying. I mean, it can be, but it's not necessarily true that what he's saying is that photography kind of has occupied this pure indexical relationship that does not have meaning, right? Painting can be representative. Other forms of records, physical records, can be representative. Okay. Okay, let's move on just in the interest of time. because I do want to talk about the movie and our other essay. Okay. So the fourth kind of basically non-contentious claim is that he sums up all of this by saying that photography completely satisfies our appetite for illusion by means of a process of mechanical reproduction in which there is no human agency at work. Okay. Now, what he's getting at here is difficult to really understand if you're not thinking about photography as he's thinking about it, okay? So how he's thinking about it is literally a physical object, okay? A photograph as a physical object. So how does traditional filmic photography work? How do you make a photograph?
Capture light. I'm not. Yes, something like that,
You
right?
expose it to light in a dark area, then you take that exposure on a special piece of film. I can't exactly remember what it's called. It's on a special sheet of paper. You expose it to light, then you keep it dark after you've exposed what you want to expose. You go into 2-layer darkroom, and begin the process of the first chemical solution, second chemical solution, third, hang it up, let it dry.
Okay, so breaking that down even further, right? What is the actual process of taking the photograph before we even get to printing it? So we let in light, right? What does that light do to the film? How is it recorded? What records the image on a photograph? Chemicals, right? There's a chemical emulsion on the back of film, yes? Okay. I know this is what I'm walking all through because most of you have not really thought through this a whole lot because you didn't grow up like taking photographs with like cameras that you were loading and unloading and developing your own thing. So, okay, you've got light captured onto that film. And what's important here too is that it is literally the light that is captured, okay? And it creates a negative image, right? You've all seen a photographic negative before, right? Okay, that is a literal record of the reflected light. That's what it's recorded, okay? That's why the image that's captured on that emulsion is all white and everything looks like it's distorted because it's a record of the light, not of the object, okay? It's that reflection of the light off of the object, okay? So then you take that and you have to then reverse it and print it in a darkroom onto paper. So he's thinking about photography here as a physical and chemical process, okay? And it's important just to keep that in mind as we move forward with this next little bit of his claim and really like dive into this part of it, okay? So the last bit of it here. Okay. The big one, okay? For the first time, the only thing to come between an object and its representation is another object. So what does this mean? What is he getting at here? For the first time, the only thing to come between photograph and its object is another object. He's talking about that physical strip of film, right? It's a literal record of the thing before it. What's tricky about Bazin is that he's now thinking about how, regardless of the photographer's input and selection, right, we're not getting, like we do in painting, brushstrokes. We're not getting the impression of the physical world and then the expression of that physical world through the creation of that plastic art. We're getting a mechanical recording of it, a chemical recording of it, which is something elemental, okay, that differentiates and creates, creates the image, literally in front of us, okay? And what he's really getting at is he's saying that photography simply, let's see, what's a way to put this? Okay, so if he's asking the question throughout this essay of what is photography, his conclusion ends up being something along the lines of it receives its whatness from the whatness of what it is of. Does that make sense? He's saying that the thing that defines photography, right? So how we can answer what it is what it is made of. And what it is made of are things which have a strict relationship to a physical reality. Okay? Which is just kind of like this big, massive idea that I don't necessarily even buy. Because what he's making it in an argument of is how photography is in some way better than, or better than other arts at representing reality. Okay. Now there are a couple of kinks here. I'm going to walk us through it real quick so that we still have like 15 minutes to talk about the other thing here. Okay. So if we look at examples of this, it's not necessarily true. I'm going to pull up a couple of photographs real quick. And then share my screen with you guys. Come on. Okay. All right, so can you all see these photographs right here? All right, so these are spirit photographs. Anybody know about these? Familiar with spirit photographs from the late 1800s, early 1900s? So spirit photography was like a very popular subject for a number of different reasons that are too, in-depth to get into right this second, but I know a lot about it if y'all want to talk to me at any point. But the idea was that you were going to capture phenomena as it exists during a seance. Okay, so what we have here is a spiritual medium, okay, in trance, generating current, okay, from her hands, right, through the spirit, through communication with spirits. This is something that's called ectoplasm, which most people are familiar with from movies, but like has a very grounded, very real history in kind of hucksterism and hoax. But basically, the idea was that the spirit of whoever the medium was communicating with would manifest physically out of their being. So you've seen representations of this in films and seance sequences and things like that, but they would actually perform these tricks live in front of people. This is one of the more famous examples of it right here. Okay. Now, all this was, you're in a dark room with very low light. Okay. The medium can be doing whatever. Sometimes they had assistants that you didn't even know about, but they would be in a cabinet, right? So like there was a box that they were in, mostly separated from people. There's no light in there, so you can't really see anything else going on. And during the trance, during communication, they would produce ectoplasm, which quite literally would be like bits of cheesecloth that they had beforehand stuffed into places they wanted it to come out of. So hiding it in their cheek, hiding it under their tongue, hiding it in their nostril. And then during the seance, they would produce it. What's going on here is she is producing this cheesecloth with photographs that have been inserted into it that possibly vaguely resemble the loved ones of people who are there to receive their reading. okay? So that you could see like, oh, this guy has a mustache. That looks like my, Uncle Billy who died in the war or whatever, right? That's the idea. Okay. So knowing what these photographs are, how does this complicate Bazan's argument about photography's relationship to reality?
Because it seems like it's reality, but it can really easily be altered. Just like all the other arts, it just takes time for people to realize what they can do with certain mediums as they have evolved over time.
Yeah, and that one with the, not with the cheesecloth coming out of her nose, but with it hovering, right? That's simply double exposure. And a lot of spirit photography was like that. So if you ever see photographs of people, Mary Todd Lincoln had a very famous one taken, because she took up spiritualism after losing her son and then also losing her husband after he was assassinated. But if you ever see photographs of people sitting and then like ghosts behind them and stuff, all of that was done with double exposure. Most of the time people knew what they were doing because they were advertised as such, and they would keep it kind of like how Bazan was talking about, like creating this memento mori, this we're going to have a remembrance of the person that has passed on, especially if people did not already have photographs of those people. And all they would do was hire people that sort of looked like their loved one, and they would take a photograph of them standing behind an empty chair, and then take the photograph of the person sitting in the chair with nothing behind them, and then they would double expose that photograph, and there you have it. Sometimes people were actually like trying to bilk people and like screw them out of money, but most of the time it was on the up and up. Okay, I have a quick message here. Okay, so do we get kind of like where Bazan is and what some of the complications are to this? Okay, a little bit. Let's talk in the last 5-10 minutes here about the Stephen Prince essay and the film we watched. Okay, so how do you all want to start? You want to talk about the movie?
Well, maybe let's do the article first.
Okay, let's do the article real quick then. So this one is kind of, since we've worked through these two things, a little easier to wrap your head around, I think, right? Basically, the claim that Prince is making here is that classical film theory has these long-held assumptions about what realism is that are tied to photographic indexicality, and new technologies like digital imaging and computer-generated imagery in film complicate these things, okay? So he comes up with this theory that he really, I mean, most of this essay is him walking through the lineage of thought that gets him here, right? But what he comes up with is what he calls perceptual realism, and how we need to think about what that means. So what is perceptual realism in Prince's terms in this essay? What does he mean by that?
Is it kind of like how maybe you're showing something that isn't real, but if it were, this is how it would be? Like,
Yeah.
this is how dinosaurs would be if Jurassic Park was real. Like, it's like showing them as realistic as possible, even though it's defying like what's actually possible in the real world.
Yes. So it's all about how we would perceive it to be real if it physically existed, okay? And also that by combining that with real images, like Jurassic Park does, like Forrest Gump does, right? It does create a realistic image, okay? So that it takes something that we know is unrealistic, combines it with something that is realistic, and then we receive it and understand it and perceive it as real, okay? That's basically the whole crux of what he's getting at here. Because he's building on these traditions, right? And saying, here's a problem, here's how we can solve it, and we can think about it. Now, the way he gets there is more complex than just looking at people like Bazan and Krakauer, although he does spend some time talking about them. Because this piece was written in the 1990s, Prince is also thinking through some of the theories we haven't gotten to yet So thinking through apparatus theory and semiology, right? So how are things represented on screen? How do we relate cognitive function to our understanding of film? This stuff is coming up, but you can get tastes of it in Prince as like how all of this starts to tie together for people thinking about films now. Okay. So he gives us lots of examples of this in the essay, but we did watch a film that, even though it might not seem like it, does also contain quite a lot of CGI. Okay. It's not entirely self-evident, because a lot of it is extremely naturalistic. The fight scenes are actually happening. People are having gun battles. They are shooting on location. So none of that is CGI. But it's employed for a whole lot of different stuff, primarily wounds, right? Gore, blood, splatter, which all the John Wick movies do, right? There's no squibs exploding anymore, condoms filled with blood, that sort of thing. It's all, added in post. As well as, certain aspects of background. So you need to digitally erase things or create backgrounds in other ways. So all that said, the old guard uses all of this in an extremely naturalistic manner. Did you pick up on any of this, or is it just because you're so familiar with CG at this point that you were able to really pick up the instances?
I know for one scene, it was like towards the beginning when they got cornered into that room in the beginning when they got
Oh
betrayed,
yeah,
and
yeah.
like
When they're
when
all
they came
shot with
back,
like 80 bullets apiece or something.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. When they actually get up and they start fighting at the end, Andy, she has that axe, and like
Mhm.
you see like the blood like dripping, and I was like, that's a bit eccentric a bit, like that's not how it would have been, but
Yeah.
like I could tell like that was added to it.
Yeah,
Okay.
aside from like the gore, I think the scene that stood out the most is at the very end when she like dives off the wind, like the building
Mm-hmm.
and crashes in the car. You can tell like that part when they're falling through is like probably green screen or definitely green screen.
Yeah. I mean, they're not going to throw an act. I mean, nowadays they're not going to throw one of
It
the
was
lead
Tom Cruise
actors out.
maybe, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Stunt crew possibly,
I
but
That's
sorry, who was that? Grace?
yeah. I thought I interrupted someone. I was gonna say that last scene when she was slinging the car and just you could see. Oh, it made me so sick. She could see her bones like popping back in. I was like, oh my god, it looks so real though. It's really
Uh-huh.
good for CGI. But yeah, that was when I noticed too. Was when she jumped off the building and hit the car and everything.
Yeah, I'm pretty like desensitized to a lot of stuff these days because of the type of films that I write about. But like seeing her with that like mangled hand
Yeah,
in all
no,
those
that
shots, but it just keeps showing. It doesn't like show it a
Mm-mm.
little bit and then cut away like a lot of movies would do. It just kind of lingers on it some. Um, just gives me the willies a little bit.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
what'd y'all think of the movie overall, though?
I didn't notice.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I didn't notice like any CGI until the guy blew up
Okay.
when they like finally found where they were hiding, and I saw his chest reconstruct. That is when I finally was like, oh, this is not special effects at all. I
Yeah,
love the
it's
movie. I love
all,
movies like that.
yeah, right, where you can completely buy into it, right? This is what Prince is getting at. It creates through, in this film, even slow build up to that big moment where it's like he's just sitting there for 3 minutes with his guts reconstructing in different shots, right? It
Yeah.
slowly builds up to a point of like you see something outlandish like that and you just completely buy it, because it's part of everything that you've seen so far, right? It didn't just lead with that. Part of what's so effective about some of his examples in the essay, like Jurassic Park and The Mask, is that the things that are CG are in some ways still tied to an indexical relationship, right? So, like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are all modeled to move around the physical actors, right? In addition to that, there were physical models of dinosaurs on set for certain parts of those scenes, right? So if you've ever seen anything about the behind the scenes making of Jurassic Park, which if you were a guy in the 90s like I was, a little guy, you definitely watched obsessively. You would know that like during the T-Rex attack in that film, the first one, it's constantly moving back and forth between like a big giant animatronic head, CG, and then like combinations of that where they would build on part of that dinosaur behind the head digitally and just completely manipulate. And yet it flows together completely seamlessly. And part of that is due to the fact that some of the stuff the actors are reacting to is actually there on scene, and it creates and contributes to that overall sense of realism, right? So that we buy into it. The Mask has Jim Carrey, who can make his face do crazy things, right? Like he's got the rubber face. That's what everybody back then would refer to when they talked about Jim Carrey. And so when you see like the Mask adding to that when he puts it on, you just completely buy it. Like, okay, yeah, this would be a natural extension of these abilities that Jim Carrey already has if there were a supernatural component to it, right? Okay. Anything else about the Old Guard?
For me, when I first watched it, I was totally into it. Like my mouth was dropped the entire movie. But then when we had to rewatch it for, analysis, I was just looking at it like, oh my gosh, like they really like put some thought into every single scene, and like their shots. The shots is what really, the edits really made the movie, because if we just watch them fighting from just one standpoint and everybody just going, it wouldn't have had the same impact because of the different shots and the different angles that we got.
Yeah, and people do that for different emphasis, right? So in the John Wick films or in Old Boy or things where you have like very extended single shot fight scenes, part of the reason they're doing that is to emphasize kind of the grueling nature of just having to go through 100 bad guys to get to the other side of the door, right? What they're getting at in the Old Guard and how they're using that is that this is almost not a struggle, specifically for Andy, but really for any of them, right? Any other thoughts on the film in general before we?
I thought you made a good point. You kind of said it in passing, but you were like, "Did you even notice the CGI?" And that was a good point, because when I started watching the movie, I was like, all right, you have to focus on, what this week's theory was in realism, and then obviously taking in that recent 90s article into account. And I was, it is like pretty seamlessly CGI'd, and especially like nowadays we're so used to it. So I wasn't sure what to expect necessarily. And, as I was watching it, I was like, it was done in a way where it's like there had to be CGI in the movie with the plot in mind, or some sort of special effects. And the way they did it wasn't like, I mean, obviously the gory hand wasn't everyone's favorite thing to see, but like I mean, there's not really another way to do it, so they did it kind of like it's to show off their skills that can be like seamless. And that's how a lot of people view film as an art, is if you can kind of like either take yourself out of it and make it not feel like a movie, or make it feel like a movie. There's those two views.
That's the push and the pull of it, right? Is that I also do want to point out the other instance of let's see, hold on, I'm gonna get to y'all's comments in the chat, give me 1 second. I do also want to point out that like it does also use all of the same stuff that Forrest Gump does to manipulate photographs and to create indexical relationships between these characters throughout history. So it has, it wasn't just like this is a fun movie, especially after 2 weeks of watching older stuff and more high-minded stuff. But it was also like it has all these through lines to some of the things that Prince is talking about. Felt like it was a Netflix series they cut into a movie. Part of that, Megan, is that it's based on a comic book series that is still ongoing. So the second story arc just finished, and the third arc, the final arc, is like next year at some point. So part of it is that they are building like a larger story into it. So I can definitely see how you would get that feeling out of it. Niall's friends packed her bags. Nothing was really said. Yeah, what a devastating moment of like realizing like your best friends are just like so freaked out by you that they don't want anything to do with you anymore.
Shunned.
Yeah. Also, the man in the iron mask. Yeah, just the idea that you're going to be locked into this iron coffin at the bottom of the ocean, dying repeatedly. The author of the comic, he's done all the math on this stuff, and basically, you know, she dies every 40-ish seconds for hundreds of years. And so part of what it's setting up, if you got that little bit of a stinger at the end, is that she comes back and she's completely crazy because she's just been doing that and thinking about being left there forever, right? Sarah, you have your hand up.
I also like how with the like editing of like their photos throughout history, it made me think about Prince's essay on like what's it called, referential fictional. So being that it is something fictional, but it made references to like very historical moments.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that it also builds itself in some way into our actual reality, right, as a means of us buying into it. Jessica, go ahead.
Like, I don't want to say her name wrong. Like Amisha said, when I watched the movie when it first released on Netflix, and then I watched it like 3 times this week just as an excuse because it was an assignment. And
good.
Like she said, the first time, mouth drops. Then as I'm watching it, I'm analyzing it. It's like the whole thing. Like we would have never bought it if they wouldn't have done it exactly how they did it. We would have never bought that they were gods. We would have never bought that what was going on if they had not strategically done each edit the way they did. If they would have never done the first scene when they all got shot up and they just get up, we would have never bought it. If they would have just been like, "Hi, we're gods. We just do whatever we want." We wouldn't have cared.
Yeah, and it creates a different type of
awesome
challenge of buying into it, right? So like at that point you have to make the fantastical real if that's your structure, right? So you have to make people buy into the like just that fact. Whereas if you're structuring it how this film does, you can use reality to structure into that world a little bit and build people up for it, as opposed to this is just the rules.
Interesting that they do die.
Yeah, and that creates
like,
complications
die,
moving forward.
And they never know when. Just like in reality, we never know when we're gonna actually die.
Right.
They don't either.
Right. And you know, the film says a lot of interesting stuff, and I know people have to go, so if y'all need to roll out, this will be up, but we're wrapping up. You know, it does set up a lot of you know, philosophical questions about, you know, what death is and means to us, right? Why would people want it, right? What does suffering look like? What does it mean? All sorts of stuff that the movie starts to get at, kind of these big life and death philosophical questions that I find really interesting on a personal level. But any final thoughts? We've run a bit long today. I do apologize. Next week, you'll have a video again. We'll come and we'll chat. But I just wanted to shake things up because I am getting bored, y'all, like to be real honest with y'all. Hold on, I'm going to stop the recording.